So here we go. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to our free LSAT prep hour. It is June 21st, 2020. And my name is Scott Miller. I'm in Durham, North Carolina. I've been a LSAT instructor for Manhattan Prep for about 6 years now. I think a little bit over 6 years. And let's talk a little bit about what we're going to do tonight. Talk a little bit about tonight's session. So these free prep hours, we do these, as you may know, we do these twice a month. We get on, one of our instructors will get on and talk about different topics. This is one of several free options that we offer for people who are preparing for the LSAT. The free prep hour is one. You also have the option to try any of our live online or in-person. I'm not doing in-person LSAT courses right now at the moment due to the situation in the world. But when we do normally do in-person LSAT courses and live online LSAT courses, the live online courses are done here in Zoom. And you have the opportunity to try out any one of our LSAT courses. You can come to session 1 of the course for free and see if you like it, see what you think. There's no obligation to take the entire course, or you can, register for the full course if you want. So we also have a lot of other good free resources on our website, in addition to these free prep hours, in addition to joining one of our other live online classes for free. So I will put a link in for those who are here tonight joining us live. I'm going to put some links in the chat window at the end of the session, links to some of the free resources and other information that you might find useful. For those of you who are joining us on YouTube and watching a recording at a later date, you can, if you look in the information for the video, you can find those links too as well. Okay. So here's what we're doing tonight. Tonight, we're going to cover the logic game section. We're going to talk about the logic game section. And we're going to talk specifically about creating hypotheticals. So, and we're using questions from our Logic Games Challenge page. And this is something that's available to anyone. Sometimes we like, since this is a free prep hour, and some people are trying to be economical about studying for the LSAT, we try to use resources that are available for free. As much as we can. Sometimes we use other resources, but any of the questions that we talk about tonight are available in our through our website in our Logic Games Challenge page. And this is kind of a continuation of if some of you may have seen this before because this recording is on YouTube. We have a recording. It's a session I did a few months ago that's called All About Hypotheticals. So this is if you're really new to what we're talking about here and you want to get more exposure to it or more information, again, I'll include a link to this video at the end of the session in the chat window, or you can go on our YouTube channel and find from just a couple months ago in 2020. I think it was actually posted in March of 2020, but it's called Free LSAT Prep Hour, LG, All About Hypotheticals. And it covers what we're about to talk about tonight in a little more detail and goes over some of the fundamentals. There are some things that we're gonna go through pretty quickly at the beginning of the session here that are covered in more detail in this session. So it's just some more information if you want it. Okay. Does anybody know what a hypothetical is? When I say hypothetical, in the chat window, let me know. Do you know what I'm talking about? Do you know what a hypothetical is? And we talk about it in logic games. In the logic game section, what is a hypothetical? Okay, an imaginary scenario that could be true. Emma, that's a really great answer. Imaginary scenario that could be true. Yeah, or if questions. Javel's talking about if questions. So yeah, the simple definition, or one definition for a hypothetical, is that it's one possible valid solution to a logic game. One valid possible solution. So the logic game section, as you may know, they're going to give you a scenario. They're going to give you this little story, scenario, some rules, and then you're going to answer questions based on the information that they give you. And there are going to be many possible solutions to these situations that they describe. There isn't just like one possible solution that you're supposed to figure out. There are many different possible solutions. And when we talk about a hypothetical, we're basically talking about a situation where we want to create one of those. And Javel, you mentioned if questions. That's definitely one place where we'll use hypotheticals. And a couple other places that we'll use them too. Hypotheticals are really useful for testing individual answer choices if and when we need to. It's a little bit of a brute force approach to logic games to have to test individual answer choices. You can you can actually do pretty well in the logic game section by just testing answer choices. But we try to have a little bit of a more nuanced way of approaching it. But if you need to, in certain situations, it just is the best approach to dive in and test answer choices. And then when we do something that's called framing, when we do something that's called framing, we use hypotheticals a lot. And actually, that other LSAT free prep hour recording on YouTube that I mentioned, the LG All About Hypotheticals, that covers framing in a lot of detail. And so if you're interested in framing, we're not going to get too much into framing tonight, but if you're interested in that, you can check out that other YouTube video if you haven't done so already and learn about how hypotheticals apply to framing. All right, so let's play a game. I'm going to show you a logic game. I'm going to have you do the setup, right? Do your normal setup. So if you're totally new to the LSAT, we know sometimes we have people, coming to these free prep hour sessions. Some people who are here with us live tonight might have just heard about the LSAT yesterday, right? And people come to these courses because they're trying to learn about the LSAT. They don't know anything about it. So if that's the case, it's okay. Just look at what I'm about to show you on this next screen and see if you can draw a little sketch or diagram that to you represents what's going on. So this is the first thing that we do when we start with a logic game. If you've been practicing for the LSAT for a while, or you've taken the LSAT already, like a lot of people have, or some people have in this session tonight, you know what to do, right? I'm going to show you scenario and constraints for a logic game. What I'm going to ask you to do is do everything up until the point where you would be ready to answer a question. So when you see the scenario and the constraints, do everything that you would normally do up until all the way up to the point where you'd be ready to look at the first question. All right, so here we go. I'll give everybody, I'm going to give everybody a few minutes to work on this. I'll give you about 2 or 3 minutes to do your setup, do your diagram. Okay, let's pause here for a second. I'd like everybody, if you would, in the chat window on a scale of 1 to 5, with 1 being easy and 5 being super hard. How challenging are you finding just the general setup, understanding the game, maybe creating some kind of diagram for the game? How challenging are you finding this on a scale of 1 to 5? Go ahead and put that in the chat window if you would. Okay, getting some 3s. Sure, my notation is clear here. So 1 is easy, 5 is super hard. You want to change your vote because I didn't make that clear. Go ahead. Okay. Got some easy, got some medium. Nobody's finding it super hard. Great. So I'm going to give you a couple. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on the setup here. A whole lot of, we'll spend a little bit of time just so we're all on the same sheet of music. But I'm going to give you a couple tips, couple things that I find really useful when working on logic games. One is I always recommend that you read all the way through the scenario and the constraints before you diagram anything. This ends up being really useful for a lot of reasons, but basically, I know like a lot of people will start reading right away, and maybe by the time you finished reading the first paragraph, you knew what type of game this was and you were already drawing a diagram. And that's great if you recognize it that quickly, but it can be a lot more effective to actually read all the way through, get a big picture idea of what's going on before you start diagramming anything. And there are a couple reasons for that. One is that sometimes there's just like a single rule. I don't know if you've run into this before, but there might be a single rule that completely changes the way that you want to set up the game. I've seen that happen in a few different games, honestly. And I would rather read that rule and go, oh, okay, wait a minute, I want to do this differently before I've ever drawn anything, rather than already have a bunch of stuff on my paper and go, bummer, and have to cross it all out and start over. So, and the other thing is when you start working on, if you run into a really challenging game, and there are some games on the LSAT that are really interesting and unique and challenging. A lot of times reading through and getting that big picture view before you try to start diagramming things makes the game just a lot clearer and easier to understand. You might be reading the scenario and going, wow, this is really weird. What the heck am I supposed to do? And you're trying to diagram stuff and it's just not seeming correct. But if you read all the way through and get that big picture view first, then a lot of times when you do start diagramming, it becomes more effective. So I always recommend reading all the way through first before you start diagramming anything. So this is a grouping game. There are 2 types of games that you run into on the LSAT, basically, ordering and grouping, and this is a grouping game. Our scenario tells us that we're painting 3 different toys, airplane, race car, and truck, and we're painting them these different colors. Each color will be used once. Each toy will be painted with exactly 2 colors. So this is what we call a basic grouping game. There are a couple of different types of grouping games. One is basic grouping. We also have what we call open grouping. And the difference between basic grouping and open grouping basically comes down to whether or not we know the exact number of spaces in each group. This is a basic grouping game because they tell us the exact number of elements in each group. With an open grouping game, we might know like a minimum, but we don't know the maximum. So that's one of the things we end up having to figure out in an open grouping game is like exactly how many spaces are there, how many elements are there in each group. That becomes an important part of the game. Then we also have what we call hybrids and 3D grouping, but this is basic grouping. Okay, so we have our basic diagram here. We're going to start notating the rules. In this first rule, again, this is just kind of a little bit of tips and advice. H and J will not be used on the same model. So the way people would often diagram that is with what we call an anti-chunk. So you can do like H and J will not be together in the same model. How many people did it that way? Give me or there might even be, I think there's even a raise hand button in your toolbar at the bottom. So raise your hand if you diagram that rule that way. Okay, a lot of people raising their hand. Totally fine, totally correct. I'm going to give you a different idea about how to do it. A different way to do it would be to put H and J side by side. We call this a cloud, right? H and J are side by side like this. So what this tells me, when I look at this, H and J side by side in a cloud is just exactly that. On my diagram, H and J are always going to be in different groups, side by side. I'm never going to see them vertically together in the same group. That's not going to happen. Now, this doesn't tell me, the reason I put a circle around them and the reason that I put that little comma in between is because I don't know. They don't have to be in that order. It could be J over here and H over here, and they don't have to be directly next to one another. So that's what the circle means and the little comma means. It's just, they're always going to be side by side. They're never going to be, you know, in the same group. Why does this matter? The only reason, again, it's not that it's incorrect. It's not that there's anything wrong with diagramming it as like the anti-chunk method that I showed a minute ago. But sometimes you might find that it's a little easier to see inferences if you diagram a rule like this first rule this way. I call it diagramming the positive. We're looking at what this actually will look like. What is this going to look like on the diagram? The elements are going to be side by side, not what that they can't look like. And again, this is a little bit of personal preference. You don't have to do it one way or the other. So we have this rule that either F or G will be in the race car, but not both. There are probably a few different ways to diagram this, but there's nothing wrong with just doing a little asterisk next to that and saying, but not both. Sometimes, you know, you don't have to diagram things in some elegant, perfect way. It's okay to just write out a little note like, you know, but not both. Indigo is either with G or J. Okay, so I'm either going to have G with I or J with I, a little or in between, making sure I'm representing both possibilities. And then G will not be used on the truck unless K is also used on the truck. So it's a conditional rule, right? This is a conditional statement, and conditional logic is all over the LSAT. We have other LSAT free prep hours we've done where our instructors have gotten into conditional logic and how to understand conditional logic. But the important thing to realize about this rule is not saying that G and K will always be together on the truck. It's saying that basically, unless K is also used, so if G is used, then K has to be there. If G is used, then K has to be there. So the if part, the conditional part, is really important, and you want to make sure that you capture that in your rule. Anytime you have language like unless or if or only if, anytime you have that in a rule, you need to make sure you capture that conditional nature of the rule. So if G is there in the truck, then we have to have K with it. Is it possible to have K in the truck without G? Could K be in the truck and then maybe G be in, I don't know, the race car? Is that okay? Would that work? K without G? Just to be clear, what I'm asking is, would it be okay if I had maybe G in the race car and K in the truck without G? Would that be okay? I have a vote for yes. The answer is yes. Yeah. And we want to be really clear about how conditional rules work. So that's what this is saying. G can't be used in the truck without K. K without G is totally fine, right? There's nothing in this rule that says that if K is there, G has to be there. It's just if G is there, then K has to be there. So this is all triggered by G being in the truck. Okay, and again, we have other, you know, we have other free prep hours where we go over conditional statements and conditional logic in a lot of detail. You really want to make sure you understand conditional logic, because rules in logic games, this is only one place where we're going to see conditional logic. It's all over the LSAT in logic games and in logical reasoning. So got to be familiar with how these conditional statements work. All right. How's this looking? Raise your hand if this is really similar to the diagram that you have. If there's anything, and if you have a question, let me ask this a different way. I'm going to lower all the hands. If you have a question, if you see anything on here that's significantly different from your diagram, and you want to talk about it, you want to get on the mic and talk about it, or you want to ask a question about it, go ahead and raise your hand right now if you have a question about this diagram, or if you want to get on the mic and talk about how your diagram is different and why. Go ahead and raise your hand. I want to make sure, especially if anybody has any questions, I want to make sure that people have the opportunity to ask questions about this, that we're all on the same sheet of music. Okay. I'm not seeing any hands. If you do have a question, you know, you can put in the chat window, just say, hey, I have a question. Or of course, you can always use that Q&A You can always type something in the Q&A window if you have a question. If you're watching from home and you have a question, put it in the comments. All right. So here's one thing that here's a rabbit hole, a trap a lot of people fall into. At this point, what we might do is look for inferences. We're going to look, a really good thing to do right now would be to look for inferences. And what is an inference? Can somebody tell me, like in the chat window, when we talk about inferences in logic games, what are we talking about when we talk about an inference? Does anybody know what that word means? Information that can be put together from the given rules. Yeah, Emma, that's a great explanation. Information or conclusions that can be drawn from the given rules. So inferences in logic games, when we talk about inferences, I always say there are two characteristics. One characteristic is it's not stated in the rules. And so it's not explicitly stated, but must be true. That's when we talk about inferences in logic games, these are the two characteristics of an inference, something that's not stated in the rules, but must be true based on the rules. So normally after we create our base diagram, we're going to take a moment and see if there are any inferences that we can make. Is there anything that we can add to our diagram that is not stated in the rules, but must be true? Does anyone see anything? You can put it in the chat window if you see something that you would add to the diagram. Or raise your hand if you want to get on microphone and explain an inference to me that you see. So I'll show you one. One type of inference would be like if there was a certain element that could not go in a certain spot. If we knew for some reason like J could not be the color in the airplane, we would want to put that on our diagram, cross J out on our diagram. If that was something that always must be true, right? That always must be true that J is not in the airplane. But I don't really see anything like that. I don't really see any reason why that would be the case. One inference that we can always make from a conditional rule is called the contrapositive, where we reverse and negate. So what that would look like is something like if K is not with G, if K and G are not together, then G is not with T. So to get the contrapositive, we reverse and negate a conditional rule. I always like writing contrapositives down. It's always a good idea to write them down because you're probably going to have to think about the contrapositive in order to answer some questions. And, I'd rather write it down once and just look at it than have to think about it and figure it out a bunch of times. So that would be one inference we could make here. Other than that, there aren't a lot of inferences, and that's actually a pretty common characteristic of these basic grouping games is you don't end up making a lot of upfront inferences. Sometimes you do, but a lot of times you don't. And you want to be comfortable with that. You really want to be comfortable playing logic games where there are not a lot of inferences to make up front, because there are a fair number of games that fit that category. And especially the better you get at making inferences, the more, I think the better people get at seeing inferences and making inferences, the less comfortable they are in situations where there really aren't any to see, or there just aren't a lot of inferences to make up front. So you want to, it's good to have some kind of systematic way of thinking about inferences. Like, are there any elements that can't go in certain places? Any elements we can combine together, or rules we can combine together? Any contrapositives I want to write down, but really have a very specific way of looking for inferences. And if you don't see any, but you want to just be comfortable moving on, right? Which is what we're going to do right now. So another thing I want to mention, the theme here is hypotheticals, right? We're talking about creating certain scenarios or solutions that we, in certain situations where we want to do that. A time when we really aren't going to just try to create a bunch of solutions or think about hypotheticals is right now. What a lot of people will do at this point is start trying out a bunch of solutions, right? They'll say, oh, well, G and I have to be together. So maybe G and I could be together with the airplane. And then I guess, so F would be with the race car. And I don't know, I guess I can put H with the race car. and so on and so on. And people will just start trying out a bunch of scenarios. Sometimes they're just trying things out. Sometimes people are literally trying to solve the game. Like, let me see if I can come up with as many solutions as possible. Either one can be a real time suck. And so, you know, we always recommend that you don't try to create a bunch of hypotheticals up front, that you don't try to create a bunch of solutions right now at this point after creating your initial diagram. There's a very narrow situation where we do that. It's called framing. And like I said, there's the other recent video that we did on the free prep hour on hypotheticals that I did a couple months ago that gets into framing really, you know, pretty thoroughly, and what framing is and when we do it. But the idea is, if you have a habit of trying to create a bunch of solutions up front, try to get out of that habit. Get comfortable answering the questions with just a really good basic overall diagram that represents the rules and shows inferences that must be true, not the could be's, but the must be's. And the better you get at that, the better you get at using that general diagram to approach the questions, the less you try to rely on creating a bunch of solutions up front, the better you're going to be. Unless you understand what framing is all about and you're comfortable framing, then yeah, there are some games where we would look at some specific solutions up front. Okay, so at this point, what we would do, we're not going to create a bunch of solutions, but we are going to do something called the big pause. And the big pause is when we, before we look at the questions, we ask ourselves a couple specific things. Does anybody know, is anybody familiar with this concept of the big pause, or concept? Are you familiar with a couple things that you might ask yourself once you've created your initial diagram and you've thought about inferences? What else might you want to think about before you go and answer the questions? Go ahead and put that in the chat window if you know. Is there anything you normally do at this point before attacking the questions? Yeah, is there anything you missed? So that's not a bad idea. Sometimes people will go back and look at the scenario and the rules and compare it to your diagram and make sure that everything is, you know, is okay. And that may not be what you're thinking of. Marv, maybe this is what you're thinking of. Maybe you're thinking, okay, I'm going to look at my diagram. I'm going to look at the rules and make sure that I didn't miss anything and make sure that I, you know, got everything right. What I would suggest, though, is if you find yourself doing that a lot, it's okay to slow down a little bit on your first read. This is something that people are really hesitant to do, but it makes a huge difference. Sometimes just slowing down a little bit when you read the scenario and the constraints and when you draw your initial diagram can prevent you from having to worry about, you know, missing anything or making any mistakes. If you find that, you know, what people often say is, oh, I misread a rule. I just made a dumb mistake. I just misread a rule. If you find yourself doing that more than just very, very, very rarely, like if it happens more than once, you really should think about slowing down a little bit when you do your original diagram. So another thing we might do in the big pause, you know, rather than worrying about things that we missed, maybe if we take a little bit more time up front, initially when we first read and diagram, we're not worried about, you know, making mistakes, but we do want to notice if there are any elements without rules. So that's another thing that we talk about in the big pause. Are there any elements without rules? So I can quickly check my elements. F, does F have a rule? Yeah, F or G is an R. G, yeah, G has a rule. H has a rule, I has a rule, J has a rule, K has a rule. So yeah, in this game, we don't have any elements without rules. We always want to check that just in case, because very often there are going to be an element without rules. If, for example, there weren't any rules that dealt with K, we'd want to circle K because K is special. K is, you know, the most free thing in the game. K can pretty much go anywhere until we're given some additional information about it. That's where we want to pay attention to any elements without rules. But in this case, that's not the case. K does have a rule, so we wouldn't circle anything in this game. The other thing we want to think about is what's driving the game. So what do you think is really important in this game? What do we need to pay attention to? Anybody have any ideas about what's going to be really important in this game? Sometimes it's worth thinking about what's most restricted in the game. And do you notice that G shows up in 3 of our rules? Like, I'm not seeing a really clear way to like link these rules together into one super rule, but definitely G shows up in several rules. G is really restricted. There's a lot going on with G. So probably anytime I'm answering a question, I'm going to have to think a lot about what's going on with G. I'm going to have to really pay attention to G. And G may be the key to dealing with some questions that are otherwise maybe difficult. If I think about G first and think, what's going on with G in this question? All right, so it's always worth taking that big pause, taking a couple moments to think about at least these two things, right? Just, you don't have to spend a minute doing the big pause. It can be just a few seconds, but always notice if there are any elements without rules and notice like what you think is going to be most important, what's driving the game. What I'd like everyone to do right now is it's like, see if there's anything that we just talked about that you want to remember and practice when you're working on a logic game. Try to, see what I hope for everyone who's here tonight in person and for anybody who's watching on YouTube is that you end up with a couple takeaways, a couple of things that you see that you think, okay, I really want to try that. I really want to try practicing that the next time I'm working on a logic game. Seems like it might help. Because it's really all about practice. That's what everything is about on the LSAT. The LSAT is, you don't really study for the LSAT, you practice for the LSAT. So try to notice some things that we're doing here tonight that you want to remember and practice and apply to your own games. Okay, so we said that one of the times when we use hypotheticals are when we see these if questions, when the LSAT gives us a question that begins with if, that gives us a new condition. And so in this question, we're given this condition, if F and J are used on the race car. So this is where we get into the idea of using a hypothetical. Now, what a lot of people are going to do, I'm going to show you the whole question. What a lot of people are going to do when they see this question is they're going to read the whole question and then they're going to start looking at answer choices. And often people will sit here and just like compare the answer choices to the diagram with their pen in their hand. And often it takes people a really long time to answer these questions when it really shouldn't. This is a question that honestly you should be able to answer in 30 seconds. So I'm going to leave it up for a few seconds. Let me see if anybody wants to. I'm going to give you 30 seconds. I'm going to see if you can come up with an answer to this question. If you come up with an answer, put it in the chat window. Okay, awesome. I'm seeing an answer, one answer in under 30 seconds. So I want to show everybody how you would answer a question like this in 30 seconds or less. And this is going to be important because this is honestly one of the most common questions that you're going to see in logic games are these if questions, these questions that are giving you a new condition. So for the purposes of answering this question, we're considering a scenario where F and J are used on the race car. Right? It doesn't mean that from now on, F and J are always used on the race car. It's just for the purpose of answering this question. So what you always want to do when you're given a new condition like this is first, ignore the rest of the question and the answer choices. And this is the hard thing to do, but you really want to ignore the rest of the question and ignore the answer choices and just focus on this condition. So what they're telling me, and draw whatever they give you. So they're saying F and J are used on the race car. Okay, let me draw that. So here's my my basic diagram, A, R, and T, and they're telling me that both F and J are used on the race car. F and J are in R. Okay. So if F and J, now what I'm going to do, so this is a temporary diagram, and this is literally the first thing I'm doing when I see this question is I'm going to my scrap paper and I'm drawing this diagram on my scrap paper. I'm drawing exactly what you see on the screen. Everything I'm going to do on the screen right now is exactly what I would be doing on my scrap paper before I do anything else with this question. So if F and J are with the race car, now I'm going to look back at my original diagram and say, okay, what else is triggered by F and J being with the race car? Are there any rules that are triggered by F and J being with the race car? And a really good way to do this is literally just to look at those parts of your diagram. Where on my diagram do I see an R, an F, or a J? Yeah. And looks like Javel sees it, right? So we have J over here with I. J is either with I or G is with I. So if J is with F, that means G is with I. And I would go ahead and draw that. G is with I. Like literally write it down. Try not to keep anything in your head when you're playing logic games. Literally write it down. So if G is with I, are any rules triggered by that? Yes. So now I go back to my diagram. What other rules do I have that deal with G? Oh, well, if G is in T, then G has to be with K. So that must mean G can't be with T. That must mean that G and I are over here with A. So you see, all I'm doing here, this is what creating hypotheticals is all about. I said tonight was going to be about creating hypotheticals. And this is what we do when we create hypotheticals. We take some initial condition. Like in this case, my initial condition is J and F being with R. You draw that on your paper. And then you look back at your original diagram and say, what rules are being triggered by that? And we don't want to draw all over our original diagram. We want to keep our original diagram clean. All this work we're doing somewhere else on our scrap paper. Okay. So now, like, who's left? G is with I, J is with F. Who's left? What elements are left? What elements are not yet on my diagram? K and H, right? Yeah, so looks like the only place for K and H to go is with T. So, and again, this seems like a lot of work. People don't want to do this because it seems like a lot of work, but it's very systematic. It's actually pretty simple to just place something on a temporary diagram, go back to your original diagram and say, what rules are triggered by that condition? And then you just keep going until you have as much information on the diagram as you can get based on the rules. It doesn't mean, like in this case, we get a really complete diagram, right? All these elements are definitely going to be in these places. G and I are definitely with A, J and F are definitely with R, K and H are definitely with T. Sometimes you're going to have a little bit of either or maybe on your diagram. That's okay. It doesn't have to be a single solution, but you're trying to get as much information on paper as you can. And then, so diagram the initial condition and see what inferences can we make? What must be true if J and F are with R? And this is what must be true. G and I are with A, K and H are with T. So now is when we want to go back and look at the rest of the question. How many different pairs of colors can be used on the truck? Okay, so here's our truck. How many different pairs of colors? Only one, right? The truck has to have H and K. So our answer is A. And, again, the idea is it might seem like you're doing a lot of work here by doing all this pre-work up front, but with a little bit of practice, you should be able to do something like that and create that temporary diagram in like 20 seconds, like literally like 20 seconds, 25 seconds, to be able to put J and F and R and then look back at your original diagram and say, what does that mean? And just go back and forth. And then once you have this initial diagram, we're ending up selecting the right answer in like, 2 seconds. So the LSAT rewards upfront work. And this is really one of the cases where you're going to use hypotheticals the most, is to answer these if questions. And if you're trying to answer these if questions without drawing out a hypothetical on your paper, sometimes you can do it on the ones that are really, really, really super easy. But it's a bad habit to get into because sometimes it's hard to tell just from looking at a question whether it's going to be super easy or not. So it's actually a better habit to get into, to just always, when you see a conditional question like this, just sit down, dive in, and start drawing something on your paper. Create a hypothetical, and then see what the answer choices, what that tells you about the answer choices. Anybody have any questions here? If you do have any questions, you can raise your hand or you can put them in the Q&A window. If not, I'm just going to keep going. So here's another one. If goldenrod is used on the airplane. So I'm going to give everybody a chance to, I'm not going to look at the answer choices yet, but I'm going to give you a chance to do what we just did, right? So this new condition they're giving us is that goldenrod, that G is used on the airplane. So if G is on the airplane, then what else do we know? What other inferences can we make? And I would like you to go ahead and do this on your own scrap paper. Just do this yourself. Go ahead and see what inferences you can make and what else can you add to the diagram based on G being an A. I'll be quiet for a minute. Sorry, let me unmute myself there. Let's see what people came up with here. Raise your hand if you want to get on the mic and talk through what you came up with and talk through, you know, what inferences you made based on G being an A. If you don't want to get on the mic, then go ahead and, you know, you can put some stuff in the chat window if you saw any good inferences. Javelle, you want to hop on the mic? Let me, so what I'm going to do is allow you to talk. And first of all, let me know if I'm pronouncing your name correctly. You should see an unmute button at the bottom corner of your screen. Yeah, you found that. So do you want to tell me what you discovered? What do we know if G is with A?
Yes. Okay. First, yes, you're saying my name right. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
So initially when I saw that G was with A, I knew that F was in race car. And then I kind of got stuck. I was like, okay, so what more inferences can I make? And then I remembered that it's either GI or JI, and H cannot be with J. So if H cannot be with J and there's limited spaces, that means I has to be with a J. So H has to be, okay. It's hard for me to explain it, but that, like my head just kind of it started to spiral into just like inferences. So let me see if I can slow down. Okay, so G is with A, now F is with C. And then I was like, I don't see anything else. But H cannot be with a J, and I has to only be with a G or I. Since we know H cannot be with J and there's only 2 spots left, I can't really explain it well, but
no,
I think
you're
you can
actually
explain
doing
it well.
you're doing a great job. I like what you're doing here, but what I might do right now, like, so F and R is the fast inference, right? We know if G is anywhere but R, F has to be in R because one or the other has to be there. And then you jumped right to, it's like you said, you're kind of stuck there for a second, but then you jumped right to where we want to go, which is what else do we know about G? Remember, we said G is really restricted. There's a lot going on with G. So when I'm given a new condition that involves G, I want to check over here and see what other rules are being triggered. And I might just go ahead and write exactly what you said on my paper. I mean, literally, I write so much on my scrap paper. I make a lot of notes on my scrap paper when I'm working on this. I try not to keep stuff in my head. So we know this, G has to be with I or J has to be with I. Okay, so let me try both those scenarios. I'm going to have one scenario where G was with I, and maybe let me draw another diagram. I mean, it doesn't take long to draw these diagrams if you're keeping them really simple. I'm not copying everything over from my other diagram. So I'm going to draw another diagram where J and I are together. Where are the J and I going to go together on this second diagram? Javelle, you want to hop on the mic again?
Okay. So if we have 2 diagrams, honestly, okay. Okay, I'm sorry. I think I can make the connection in my head, but it's really hard to explain it. So I think I'm just gonna let you do the rest.
Okay. Well, we have exactly 2 elements in each space. Or sorry, exactly 2 elements with each group, right? 2 elements with the aircraft, 2 elements with the race car, 2 elements with the truck. And if J and I are going to have to be together on this right side diagram here, the only place that J and I can go together is with the truck. That's the only place where there's room for J and I. So all I've done here is considered the 2 possibilities. I'm either going to have I with G, which is what's over here on the left side, or I'm going to have I with J. And the only place I can go with J in this diagram with G in A, the only place I and J can go together is on T. So again, all I'm doing is looking at what I have in my initial diagram, comparing it to, you know, what my new condition is. And if I have to draw 2 diagrams to represent 2 different scenarios that are possible here, I'm going to go ahead and do that. I'll go ahead and draw 2 diagrams. So now I'm thinking about who's left. And in this, I'm going to go back to my left side diagram here. And now you mentioned H and J, right? H and J are also very important because H and J have to be separate. So let me add that to my diagram. H is going to have to be in one of these groups. I can't have H and J together in T. So H is going to, one of them is going to have to be with R and one of them is going to have to be with T. And a great way to show that is just to put them there and put a circle around, right? that circle, I call it a cloud. It's kind of like in my original diagram. What that tells me is H is going to be in one of those spots and J is going to be the other. I just don't know which one is which, right? They can switch back and forth. And then who's left? Well, the only person left is K. So K will have to be in T. So now this left-hand diagram is done. And again, all I'm doing is going back and forth between what I had already, what I had existing in this left diagram, and my original diagram, seeing what rules are triggered, adding those rules to my diagram here. So now I'm going to go to my right-hand diagram here on this side of the screen and say, okay, who's not there yet? I have G, F, J, and I. I have 2 spaces left. Looks like that's going to be K and H, right? That's all that's left. H can't be with J, but it's not going to be with J. K can kind of do whatever K wants, right? So I'm going to have H and K in these 2 spaces. Draw a circle around them because H doesn't have to be with A. H could be with R. K, same thing, can switch back and forth. So now I have 2 complete diagrams. And, you know, we just talked through this. I mean, Javelle, we spent a couple minutes talking about this. You're doing really well with just seeing those initial steps. I think, you know, you're saying like it's getting messed up in your head or it's getting jumbled up in your head. That happens on logic games all the time. And the solution for that is to just do what we're doing here and put things on paper. So, because it happens to me all the time, like I'll start trying to figure things out in my head, keeping things in my head, because I don't want to write a bunch of stuff down because it seems like it's going to take a long time. Yet, as you can see, if we just take the time to, you know, when you see there are 2 possibilities, okay, draw the 2 possibilities. I'm either going to have I with G or I with J. If I have to draw a second diagram to represent that, I'll do that. Sometimes to answer these conditional questions, I draw 3 diagrams and I really don't care. Like it's totally fine to draw 3 separate diagrams. But get it on paper because it's much faster and easier than trying to keep it in your head, much less trying to keep it in your head and explain it. And I'm kind of at an advantage here because I'm the one with the pen and I can put it on the screen, but this is just what we want to do, get things on paper. So now that I have this on my scrap paper, and again, maybe it takes me a minute to write all this down, right? Maybe it takes me a minute based on the condition that G is with A to make these inferences that I is either going to be with G or I is going to be with J. If I is with J, it has to be with T, and then fill in the rest of these diagrams. Maybe it takes me a minute and 20 seconds, let's say. But now let's look back at the question. Each of the following could be true except. Okay, H is used on the airplane. Is that a could be? Can H be used on the airplane? Yeah, that's a could be, right? That happens over here in my right-hand diagram. I'll just call this diagram 1 and this one diagram 2. So that happens in diagram 2. Khaki is used on the airplane. Yeah, remember, H and K can switch on diagram 2, so that's a could be. A jonquil is used on the race car. Yep, H and J can switch back and forth here. And if it makes more sense, rather than doing a cloud, if you prefer to do like little back and forth arrows, if that's easier for you to understand, for your brain, if that works better for your brain, do it that way. You don't have to use the cloud circles. But again, we can see that J can be used on the race car here, so that's a could be. Continuing right along, indigo is used on the race car. Indigo is used on the race car. Bueller, that's an old movie. Maybe you never saw it, so we won't worry about it. But I don't have on either diagram 1 or diagram 2 indigo used with the race car. Indigo is either with the airplane in diagram 1 or with the truck in diagram 2. So that means that's false. Each of the following could be true except A, B, C, all could be true. D is the one that must be false, cannot be true. So that's my correct answer. So again, even with this kind of complicated question, still look at how fast we can work through the answer choices. I mean, even with me here kind of narrating what I'm doing, telling you what I'm doing while I'm doing it, notice how quickly we can work through the answer choices, even on this kind of relatively complicated question, except question, if we do the upfront work, if we have this on our page to look at. So you can see what I'm selling you on here, right? It's the idea that hypotheticals are really useful. It's really useful when you're answering questions. It's going to be crucial sometimes to write things down and work out a possible solution. But the whole key to it is writing it down, getting it on paper, trying not to, I mean, if you look at my, scrap paper when I'm working on logic games, I have a lot of stuff written down and, I'll scratch something out. If I try a hypothetical and it doesn't work, I'm going to scratch it out. So everything that you see here might be what my scrap paper looks like. And I always number my questions. Like this is question number, 5 in this game that we're working on. So I would always have a little 5 next to where I'm doing my work on my scrap paper. But the idea is by writing things down like this, we always want to do it in our heads. We always want to do the work in our heads and not put things on paper because it seems like putting things on paper is harder and takes longer. But this whole process of creating hypotheticals is very, very systematic, right? It's very step-by-step process. And once you have these hypotheticals on your page, then it's pretty easy to come up with correct answers when you look at the answer choices. So I'm going to go ahead and do one more here. I know we're getting almost to the end of our time. I'm going to show you another way that we might use hypotheticals, and that is to test an individual answer choice. And I'm just going to do this one kind of quickly. So this is a question that asks, which of the following would determine the colors for all 3 models? Which of the following, so this is I think we call this like a complete determination question. You'll see these. What they're asking you for is the answer choice that, if true, would force every single element into a certain space, right? Would completely tell us what color the colors for each of these 3 models of toys. Okay, so I have these answer choices, 5 answer choices. And you might look at them first and say, wow, like, how do we know? How do we know which one, if goldenrod is in the airplane? Well, actually, we can eliminate that based on the work that we just did, right? So sometimes a way to answer these questions is, and this kind of brings up a useful thing, is another reason why I don't mind taking the time to create these hypotheticals is because each of these is a valid solution to the game, right? There is a solution, a valid solution that follows all the rules where I and G are in A, F is in R, K is in T, and H and G are in one or the other. Same thing over here. So notice how I can use that to eliminate some of these answers. Goldenrod is used in the airplane. No, that's not going to give me one single solution because I see there are 2 possibilities here where goldenrod is with the airplane. So I could eliminate that. Goldenrod is used on the race car. I don't know. So these others might be I don't knows. So what I might do in this case, I mean, maybe even if I didn't have these diagrams drawn already, we can be a little strategic in testing answer choices. So if possible, I'd only like to test. I mean, I could just start testing answer choices if I wanted to, right? Let me put goldenrod in the airplane and see what happens. See if I get like every other element falling into place. You could do that, and you can actually answer questions surprisingly quickly by doing that, but I want to be a little more strategic. So does anybody see one of these answer choices, A, B, C, D, or E, that seems like it could be a good candidate? Not that you're sure it's right, but are any of these maybe seem a little more likely to be right than the others? D. So Marv, what do you see about D that makes it appealing? And if you want to get on the mic, you can. If you don't, you can put it in the chat window. That's up to you.
Yeah, so with D, once you actually plug it in, it kind of force like all of the rules to like move in place.
Okay, so let's try it out. If D looks good, let's try it out. So we have airplane, race car, and truck. And D says fuchsia is used on the airplane. So I'm going to put fuchsia on the airplane. So that forces G to be in R, right? Because we have that rule trigger. Either F or G has to be with R. Okay, great. So who's next? So do we know now if where I goes? Because G can be with I or J can be with I. Does I have to, I don't know. It looks like I could be with G, and then I can't have H and J together. So maybe I can put J over here and H over here and K over here. But I could also do, in the same situation, I can do F here, G here. So G would have to be there if F is in with the airplane. But couldn't I also maybe put J with I, and then H and J would be separate, and then I could put K over here. So, I mean, it's a good contender, right? Fuchsia is used in the airplane as a good contender because it triggers this rule. It tells us something about G, but unfortunately, it leaves a lot of the other pieces open. So that's okay. Sometimes when you're working on these questions, you got to try things out, right? I would rather have somebody like say, yeah, like try D and give it a shot, right? And try it and end up being wrong. Sometimes you got to take chances on the LSAT, and you might end up not being correct, but it's better to make a move and try something out rather than sit there and like wonder. And you know, sometimes you just got to be, you got to practice being confident sometimes on the LSAT. So great, we tried D, it didn't work. One of the things that I would look at, so we'll look at this from a different perspective. Remember that big pause, right? Remember in the big pause, we said G is going to be really important. G is really restricted because we have a lot of rules dealing with G. So I might be tempted to look at A, B, and C, and which one of those places the biggest restriction on G? So maybe C, because G in the truck triggers two of these rules, right? If G is in the truck, then what other rule is triggered? I know that K also has to be in the truck, right? So now I'm taking up, and still I know F has to be here. So now I've just, by putting G in the truck, I'm not just triggering one rule, I'm triggering two rules. That's what we're kind of looking for. We're trying to trigger multiple things. Yeah, and so now, Javel, you put it, you said it. J we know has to be with I because G is with K. And so the only place they can go is over here. J would have to be with I and Art. And then who's left? H. H goes with F on the race car. Am I breaking any rules here? Nope. H and J are apart. J is with I. G has K with it in the truck. Okay. So by placing G in the truck, I've triggered everything else. There's no either ors, no maybes. But notice that to know that C is correct, I took the time to try it out. I took the time to test it. So you want to get comfortable to the point where you are really comfortable trying out answer choices and just testing things out. I mean, it's really valuable to do that. Ideally, if you can avoid, and like, imagine if we had just tried A, B, and C, and imagine if it took like 30 seconds to create each of those diagrams, 30 seconds to test A and say, no, it's not actually going to work. And then another 30 seconds to test B and say, no, it's not going to work. And another 30 seconds to test C and say, oh yeah, so C is our correct answer. So the idea here is in a minute and a half, we could answer this question. I like to answer questions a little bit closer to a minute, but if some take a little bit longer, that's okay. But the idea is still in a minute and a half, you're answering the question, you're at the correct answer. And that's by checking each individual answer choice. Sometimes we can be a little more strategic about it and look at one of the answer choices that seems the most restricted, test that first. Which one is going to trigger the most rules, right? Test it for a must be true, or what concern what creates a complete solution. And yeah, Marv, like you put in the like you put in the chat window, what triggers the most rules? C is triggering a lot of rules. Okay, so a couple different ways we use hypotheticals. We use hypotheticals when we're faced with those if questions. We use hypotheticals if we need to test individual answer choices to know that an answer choice is correct. And if you can zero in a little bit on one of the answer choices that seems more appealing to test, rather than testing all of them, that's even better. If you can use your work from other questions, if you can use a hypothetical that you created for one question to answer other questions, that ends up, being even better. So hopefully we gave you a few ideas tonight about maybe approaching logic games in general, a few ideas about how creating hypotheticals work. Again, it's all about just going back and forth. It's all about just adding, starting with the thing that you want to test. What happens when G is in T? And then what rules are triggered by that? Add that to your diagram. Okay, now what other rules are being triggered? What else must be true? Add that to your diagram. what other rules are being triggered. And you just go back and forth until you have as much information on the diagram as you can get, and then answer the question. So a couple other things to let people know, just to wrap things up here. Thanks for being here. Thanks for everybody who stuck around a couple extra minutes while we finished up this last question. Again, think about your takeaways. Think about anything that we did tonight or talked about tonight that you found interesting or useful that you want to practice. And practice it. Like, that's the whole key here, practicing. And then a lot of the stuff, you know, some of the stuff we talked about are specific to grouping games like this one. A lot of the stuff we talked about will apply to any type of logic game, grouping, ordering, whatever, even some of the weird games. So I mentioned that there are some other free options. Again, if you're watching us, if you're joining us from home on YouTube, look in the description for the video and you'll find some links to some free resources. For those who are joining us here live tonight, I will go ahead and put some links in the chat window. Again, we do these free prep hours a couple times a month, and you can sign up on our website to attend one of these free prep hours live for free. This was, and one of the free resources you'll see on our website are the Logic Games Challenges. This is called the Toy Maker. So if you want to go back and try this on your own, try this game on your own, you can find that on our website. These logic challenges, I will say, and we say this on the website, these are games that our instructors have created. So they're not 100% perfectly corresponding exactly like real, you know, LSAC logic games. They are really close though, and they often give you a chance to practice specific elements or aspects of logic games that end up being, you know, really useful and apply to the, you know, the actual games on the LSAT. For example, this particular game gives you a lot of those if questions, a lot of those hypothetical questions where you have a chance to create hypotheticals to you know, before you look at the answer choices. And again, you can always attend if this was interesting and you want to get more. You can attend session 1 of any of our in-person or online complete courses for free. The session 1 of our courses, all of our course sessions are 3 hours long. So we just did an hour tonight. You get 3 hours. Normally, we don't just talk about one section of the test like logic games. When we do the complete courses, the sessions in the complete courses, we usually cover at least 2, if not all 3 of the sections of the LSAT. So if you want to check that out, again, go to our website. You can sign up for one of these for free. And that's all I got, folks. Thanks for being here. Thanks to anybody who's watching us from home. And yeah, good luck with your LSAT prep.